scientifically correct. And number 6, the next day we looked at whether the theory of evolution, its fundamentals will stand scrutiny, and whether when we compare the theory of evolution to the criteria set for a good scientific theory, it does not meet them. And so we left it aside and said, okay, it could be an idea, we can discuss it out, but you can't treat it as fact. And if you cannot treat that as fact, we said, then that does not negate the previous study we made, which was God does exist. So when you bring in natural selection, which is now we found a questionable theory, not a scientific theory, then with that you can't hit against the existence of God and say he's not in existence. So God still stands. Once we did that, then we looked at number 7, relativism, which says that all statements on earth are only relatively true. Nobody knows the truth. We saw that that doesn't stand scrutiny. In other words, there is something known as fact and there is something known as truth we can look for. And then number 8, which is religious relativism, which is called pluralism, which claims that all the religions on earth are exactly the same. When we looked at the writings, no, sir. Every religion claimed to be the only way. And then by logic, when we looked at more than one who is saying the same thing, then we realized that all cannot be correct, all cannot be wrong. So we are left with only one option, and that is only one among the claims is legitimately correct when it says it is the only way. And then we wondered whether we can compare apples and oranges. No, we can't. But if we put another factor onto them, we can make a choice. I hope you remember that. We made a choice, or at least I made when I gave you that illustration. I like oranges, but I chose the apple. Why? Because I had put rottenness and freshness together. And when you put that, then I had to choose the one, and everybody agrees that that's a correct choice that I made. So when we look at the different religions, belief systems, we cannot compare the doctrines and the tenets of belief. There's no standard. So we're going to put something else, and we said we're going to put the stories and make them into a para-religious factor. We'll put those and see whether it can help us make a decision. And then we said, when you look for only one, then it doesn't have to be way out in front. It doesn't have to be the best and the most superior. It just has to be different. If it is separate and looks different clearly from the others, then that's the one. And we gave some examples. And we said, if there are, for example, 5 marbles in my hand, and we already said there's only one that's correctly colored. If there are 4 green and 1 red, which is the correct colored marble? Red, because there was only one of those. So let's check this out once again. Let's see if we can answer this. We're watching a race, okay? Whoever comes to the tape first. So we're going to see who's going to come to the tape first. We also said that only one is doing it correctly. So when the starter's gun, bang, goes off, everyone is running except one guy is walking. Which is the correct way to compete? Walking. Why? Because there's only one guy doing it. Who will reach the tape first? The runners, but they'll be disqualified because that's not the right way to run that race. Walking was the correct way. So whenever you look at these different claims, look for the one that is separate. What did we call it? The red marble. So number 9, we will evaluate the 10 questions, which we call the para-religious factors, to look for what we call the red marble, the one that is separate. So with that, let's get on to today's topic. Ancient literature. That means all this religious literature that's classified. We're going to look at 5 major world religions: Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, and Judaism. The founders I've put there. No, in Hinduism, there is no founder. They're authors. So I've just written one author there. There are no founders in Hinduism. However, the literature, the earliest is some writings that are non-specific, but the Structured writing begins with the Vedas. The Rig Veda is the first one, the Sama, Yajur, and the Tharva Vedas, and then an anthology which is called the Upanishads. After that, the Ramayana, and then the Bhagavad Gita, which is actually inside Mahabharata. So they have literature we can look at. Islam, Muhammad is the founder, definitely, and their literature is Quran, but is also what is called the Hadith. Hadith is the traditional writings. There are lots of traditional writings, and you put them together. Quran plus Hadith gives you a picture of Islam. Buddhism, Gautama Buddha, he didn't write, others wrote for him, but there's a lot of Buddhist writings, and we will go to some of them. Christianity, Jesus is the founder, and Christian. Yesterday we said Christians agree to the Judaic scriptures as well, so they're called Judeo-Christian, Old Testament and New Testament, which make the Bible. And Judaism, Moses basically is the founder, the one who wrote everything down for them. And it's not just the Old Testament, but the study of the Torah. It's called the Talmud, if you know that word. The full name is Talmud Torah, study of the Torah. So the prophets, writings, and the Torah, and the study of the Torah called the Talmud, that forms the literature. So now we're going to ask, when you look at these, how are these ancient literatures classified? And here there are four. They're classified basically into four types. Number one, folklore or folk tale. Number two, it's a legend. Number three, a myth. And number four, historical. What do we mean by these words? A folk tale, there is no attempt to state a real or true story. Everyone knows that the story is not factual. So, the sun can smile at you, and the breeze can come and give you a little secret, and all the birds and the animals can meet for a committee meeting. We know it's not true. What they do is write that story out so that we can bring out a lesson or a moral. So everybody agrees that a folk tale need not be true at all. It could be, but there's no evidence that is true. By the way, let's just go back to the four here. When you look at these four, when you look at the credibility of the stories, you and I will have to agree that the most credible is the historical. Okay, so that's what we're looking for. What's a legend? A legend probably is based on a real true story. So it starts off as a real true story, but after some time, slowly changes will creep in, exaggerate this and make this bigger until an ordinary human becomes superhuman. And when do the changes begin? This is key. The changes begin generations after the event, when there are no any eyewitnesses left to challenge your change. So we use the word legend very loosely today. That's not how historians use the word legend. Today, you and I will say, hey, he's a cricketing legend. I'm from India and England. In fact, they're having the matches right now. And we say, this guy, he is legend. But really, that word legend is not really true to its word. When we use the word legend, we just mean that he's good at it, very good at it. Legend really means when the history of that individual is changed over a period of time, and it's centuries, so that an ordinary person becomes extraordinary, just not extraordinary, but superhuman. And the time period to make legends is usually centuries. Here's an example from the story of Gautama Buddha. Later, after his death, this artist made a medallion. So that's the quote that we have on the screen. This medallion dates back certainly to the 2nd century BC. If we put the Buddha's nirvana or death during the 5th century BC, then the artist who carved the medallion must have lived at a time when the memory of the Blessed One, Gautama Buddha, was still very fresh in the minds of the people. How many years? 300 years, and the memory is still fresh. You can't make too many changes. So, in the historian's eyes, legends are made generations later. It's not made in the generation of the actual event. A myth is so far back in history, it is generally accepted as somebody's imagination. The story could be true, but you can't establish it. And the characters that are described there also could be true, but it's so hazy and nebulous and so far away, we can't check it out. And it usually involves the supernatural world of gods and goddesses. So a myth is very far back in history, and we cannot establish any real facts about it. So the time period is usually many, many centuries and even millennia or thousands of years. So a myth is not wrong, it just has less credibility as far as the historicity is concerned. Historical, here the attempt is to state the story as it really was. And when you look at historical pieces of literature, there are no significant additions, no core changes. By the way, all ancient literature has change, all across the board. So don't tell anyone that your religious literature has no change. No, every piece of literature from the ancient world, especially the religious literature, has change. And they have lots of changes sometimes. But the question is, are those changes so major as to change the actual core of the story, or are they peripheral changes? Remember, they could be peripheral, they could be central, but there are changes. So that does not mean it's historical. It just means the changes, big ones reduce the credibility, small ones retain the credibility of the story. And if the historical writing is closer to the event itself that happened, then the credibility rises. So you'll see on the screen some letters and some dashes. EV is the event. Whenever there is an event that is spectacular or where it is unusual, then the community makes that into a story. They want to keep it alive. And the first thing that happens is to make it an oral story in those days. This is thousands of years earlier, hundreds of years earlier. You make it into an oral tradition, OT. So the event becomes an oral tradition, which is passed down from generation to generation. And finally, one of them will say, hey, we might forget the details. Let's write it down. So later on, they write it down. It becomes WT, which is the written tradition. And then we recognize today we have none of the original writings of any of these religious writings. None. But we do have copies. And so the question is, which is the earliest copy that we have? And EM is the earliest manuscript, the handwritten ones. And you'll see the dashes on the screen there. That is the gap. So here's what we're trying to say. If the gaps are really wide, then the credibility of the story goes down. If the gaps are really close, then the credibility goes up. So, with that, we're going to look at the writings themselves. Here's Hinduism. Like we mentioned, the Rig Veda is the earliest text, followed by the next three Veda texts, the Atharva, the Samai, and the Ajur, and then an anthology, the Upanishads, and then an epic, the Ramayana, in which the hero is Rama and his wife Sita, and then the epic Mahabharata, in which is found the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is the kind of the core that most Hindus will say contains the basics of Hinduism. Although that's not really true because it came down from a lot of generations and the whole lot of other ideas are there in the Vedic text, for example. However, the Bhagavad Gita is understood to be the core. But remember, when you look at this list here, the Bhagavad Gita is the baby of them all. All the others came earlier. So now, here's a statement from the introduction to the Bhagavad Gita. Lord Krishna first spoke Bhagavad Gita to the sun god some hundreds of millions of years ago. Now, if you say it's hundreds of millions, then we have to agree that we cannot, no human can check the veracity, check the credibility of this statement. Hundreds of millions, who can go back then? We have no record. But they do say that it was lost to the human race and then brought back to the human race 5,000 years ago at the beginning of this age. Hinduism has basically four ages and then they cycle. It's a cyclical type of keeping of time periods. We are in the last one, or at least the last one. It's called Kali Yuga, and Bhagavad Gita was brought back to human race at the start of Kali Yuga, which is 5,000 years ago, 3,102 BC. How can anyone go back then, even then, to check? And that is why Krishna, it says in the ultimate encyclopedia of mythology, Krishna, according to Hindu mythology, is an avatar or an incarnate of the god Vishnu, the preserver of the universe. Now, that doesn't mean Hinduism is all wrong. It just means that the basic stories, both Ramayana and the Mahabharata, are more mythological in their writings. You can't dismiss the philosophy, but the story is what we are looking at right now, focused. That's mythological, and I think everybody understands and acknowledges that. How about Buddhism? I'm going to read out four statements, and they are in chronological order. I want you to watch what happens over the period of time that we are going to look at. Statement one: the humanity of the Buddha is also expressed by a Theravada monk. Who is a Theravada monk? A Theravada monk is one who lived at the time of Gautama Buddha. There were other monks later on, but these people were called the Theravada, early ones. The word Theravada means the elders, the ones who were right at that time. Here's a statement from a Theravada monk. Was he, Gautama Buddha, not born at Lumbini? Did he not complete existence at Kusinara? In other words, he was born here and he died here, just like anyone else. Statement number two, again from the Buddhist writings. Soon after the passing of the master, Gautama Buddha, a change began to set in. So there's a change. Statement number three. At the beginning of the Christian era, do you know how many years have gone by? 450 to 500 years have gone by now. The transcendental, superhuman nature of the Buddha became more and more pronounced. Can you see what's happening? He was an ordinary human being, and then there was a change, and this change became more and more. How about number four? In one of the most important pieces of Mahayana literature, Mahayana is a later form of Buddhism. The earlier one was called Theravada. The other word that they use is Hinayana. It means a lesser vehicle. And Mahayana is a bigger vehicle. It came later on. In this Mahayana literature, there is not much of the man left in the Buddha. He is now an exalted being who has lived for countless ages in the past and will continue to live forever. Can you see what has happened in these four statements I have read? In the beginning, he was born here, he died here, just like anybody else. But Mahayana, Buddhism, which came to the scene about 700 to 1,000 years later, no, he was not born, he was always there, and he didn't die, he will live forever. A change from the human to the superhuman. It's very clear in the sequence. So, what do we classify this? Then it is classified as a legend. It starts off correct, ordinary human, but then superhuman qualities come in and make us ordinary human into a superhuman. So, that story is a legend. How about Judaism? There are 39 books, 20 different authors living at vastly different periods of history. Some writings appear questionable, others are accurately historical. So I'm confessing to you, I didn't classify because it's hard to classify so many authors all together. Some are looking this way and some appear that way. Some are more credible, some are questionable. So I just left it unclassified. That's the truth of the matter, at least in my search. Now, some of you will say, why didn't you classify it? Well, I just didn't. So if you want to classify it, here's a chance for you to be active. You take that book, read it through, and see if you can classify it according to the criteria we set. And it's okay. You can classify it. If you do, good. And we can discuss that. How about Islam? The Quran was put together in writing by 652 CE, Common Era, the same as AD. They don't like anno, anno domino, meaning relationship to Christ, so change it to CE, the same. 652 CE, within 20 years of Muhammad's life. The writing was confined to one generation, but most people, even among Muslims, don't realize that Muhammad did not write it. In Islamic tradition, Muhammad is the only inspired individual. Nobody else was inspired, only Muhammad. So if Muhammad did not write, then uninspired individuals wrote it. That's the clear cut logical deduction. And Muhammad, when he spoke it out, how did they get it together then? It says on the screen here it was compiled twice. If you compile it, then you have to compile it from some place. So, how do we know what was happening? Well, we go to the Hadith, the traditional writings of the Islamic of the Muslim faith. Now, Hadith, the writings are named after the author, the one who writes it out. That is that Hadith. Uh, and there are four levels of Hadith in their credibility and authenticity. The highest level is called Sahih. So if you quote from a Sahih Hadith, well, you're okay. You're on solid ground. The next one is Hasan. That's also acceptable, Hasan level. But the lower two level, Maudu and Daif, those are not good to really establish anything in your faith, in the Muslim faith. So you look at the hadith, which are called Sahih. When you read that, you realize that the Quran was compiled two times. Once 2 years after Muhammad's death, and another one 18 years later. Now, where did they compile it from then? They compiled it and they write it down. In fact, the person who was given charge to compile it, his name is Zayd bin Thabit. He and a few others, they said, can you please compile it? And that's a story we can go into later on if you want to. But right now, it's compiled. So where did they compile it from? They compiled it from 5 different sources. Number one, they looked at certain palm leaves stems. Now, the stems of palm leaves are actually quite broad. So you can do an etch on that. So what happened? Muhammad came from the mountain with the message from Angel Jibril, and he said the statements out. And so people who are listening said, we might forget. So some of them etched it onto palm leaf stems. That's number one. Number two, those days they used to use writing material, which was the shoulder blades of camels. The camel shoulder blade is very broad and flat. So if you bleach it, then it becomes a good board on which you could write. So stems of leaves, shoulder blades of camels, pieces of leather, again, on which you could etch, pieces of paper, rough paper in those days. This is 600 AD. And number 5, memory. So the compilers had to go through all of these 5 different sources and then compile the Quran. So we must not think that the Quran was simply stated by Muhammad and it was made into a Quran. No, there's a history, there's a story about how the Quran was actually compiled. And this is the story. And it was compiled twice. And look at the statement on the screen. After the second time it was compiled, all the manuscripts from where you got your story were ordered destroyed by Uthman, who was the third caliph at that time. And so the present Quran is called the Uthmanic recension. It is at his orders that it was compiled and all the others were destroyed. Now, can you see what's happening? If anybody wants to check whether what is in the Quran today is actually what Muhammad said, you can't do it. You can't establish it, because the manuscripts from where we got the present Quran have almost all been destroyed. But we will give it credit. Remember, we said we'll be honest and give it credit where credit is due. Whatever is there was written within 20 years of Muhammad's life. That's a short one. So we'll say it is, yeah, it's historical. But there's a question. When it comes to Christianity, the earliest manuscript was about 114 to 134 AD. The original manuscripts were within 20 to 50 years of the life of Jesus. It was confined to one generation. No core changes. Changes? Yes, no core changes to the story of Jesus. Especially, we're talking about the New Testament. So, when we look at the New Testament, we think, okay, which is the earliest book and earliest writing? Really, it was not writing in the New Testament that is the earliest Christian writing. It's outside the New Testament. Eliezer Sukenik, professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, found two ossuaries. What are ossuaries? Receptacle spots in which you put the dead man's bones and bury that. That's how they buried people at a certain time in Jewish history. On these ossuaries are found the earliest known Christian writing. They are dated about 41 AD, within 10 years of Jesus' life. One of those ossuaries says, Jesus, God. And the other one, Jesus ascended one. Now think, it took 700 to 1,000 years to change Buddha from an ordinary human being to a godlike being. Here, in just 10 short years, you have shifted from the event to the oral tradition to the written tradition. And this is the earliest. There is no earlier writing than this. It is the actual writing on the ossuary. So it is the written tradition, not even the earliest manuscript, the original manuscript. All the while, in that 10 years, as God, no change at all. So, in the historian's eyes, no gap, no change at all. So, I'm going to quote three of the world's top archaeologists. They're accepted as the world's top. One is an American, and one is a Jewish archaeologist, and the third is a British archaeologist. Here are their words. Sir William Albright is an American archaeologist. We can already say emphatically that there is no longer any solid base for dating any book of the New Testament after about AD 80. Nelson Gluck is a Jewish archaeologist. It may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. Now, that's a big statement. In other words, with all his work as an archaeologist, he has not found one archaeological finding that has ever disproved or controverted a biblical reference that we read in the Bible. The third archaeologist is Sir William Ramsay. He is arguably the top. Sir William Ramsay did his archaeological work in the same period as the New Testament, but he never accepted the New Testament as authentic. He thought it was written much later. It was too accurate in one sense to have it at that time. I mean, to say that it was at that time, because later on you can look what happened and you can write down and it becomes accurate. So he was suspicious about it being originally in the first century. So he was suspicious about the document. One day he found something in his archaeological work, in his digs, and he could not explain it. He said, how can this be here? I have not found this as an explanation in any document. So how do we explain this? He went here and then suddenly, and the people told him, hey, there's one more document you can read. And that's the document of the New Testament, the book of Acts, book of Luke. And he went and read Luke, and whoa, Luke unraveled the perplexity. So he said, "Well, okay, good for Luke." And then he went around digging again and he found another perplexing situation. And once again, the only document that unraveled his perplexity was Acts written by the book of Luke. This went on and on for 30 years. How many years? 30 years. And after 30 years, this is what Sir William Ramsay said of Luke. Luke's history is unsurpassed in respect of its trustworthiness. This author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians, not religious historians, very greatest of historians. After 30 years of comparing his archaeological findings with Luke's writing, this is what he said. Amazing statement from the top archaeologist this world has ever known. Norman Geisler is a Christian apologist, and this is what he says. In all, Luke names 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 islands without error. That is amazing. Legendary writings and mythological writings do not have that accuracy. 32 countries, 54 cities, 9 islands without a single mistake. That's amazing. So let's take a break now. And like we said, we haven't finished this. We're taking a break, but the organizers would like me to throw out this time, throw open this time for questions as well. So while we take a break, if anybody has a question, we'll be happy to discuss it.
Hi, Dr. Pandit. I'm Clarissa. I'm going to be helping hosting this evening with questions. So just like Dr. Pandit says, anyone who is watching live on Facebook, on YouTube, and obviously here as well with us here on Zoom, please do put your questions in the chat. For me personally, I was completely blown away with what you just said there about the Book of Luke. I've definitely not heard that before, so yeah, I'm definitely.
Clarissa, and also I would like to just mention that the questions may be not just from today, but
Sure.
from the day one. So
Okay.
any topic from the day one up to what we've said now can be asked as questions.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you very much. One thing, could you just re-explain the EVOTWTEN?
Oh yeah.
Can you repeat that
That's
again for us?
that really is an excellent question for the simple reason that if you understand that, you will understand the level of credibility that the historians place on any piece of literature. EV is when the event takes place. And if an event is kind of unusual, then the people make it into a story. And a few of them get together, make it into a story. Once the story is set, it is called the oral tradition because in those days, writing was extremely difficult. So we would write, we would tell the story now. We've made the story, now we tell the story to our children, they tell it to the next. And after a few generations, they say, well, I'm not sure about the details. Let us write it down. So somebody takes the trouble now, and that is why they don't write it down. It takes a lot of trouble in those days to write it down, bring the papyrus and get the correct ink and write. So now we want to write it down. So once it's written, it's called the WT, the written tradition. And then we recognize we do not have any of the original manuscripts. So when we do not have an original manuscript, we look for whatever we have, and it's called the manuscripts in our hands. And among them, we look for the earliest manuscript we have. In other words, we are trying to make it as close as possible so that it has credibility. So when you look at that, those dashes we mentioned are the gaps. What is the gap between the actual event and the time they made it into an oral tradition? What is the gap between the oral tradition and the written tradition? And what is the gap between the written tradition, the earliest manuscript we have? If the gaps are big, then the credibility goes down. If the gaps are really short, then the credibility of that writing goes up. So that is what we were trying to portray by that study.
Fantastic, thank you. I have a question that's just come in our chat. It says, from the analysis, Christianity is more closer to the truth. So I will ask, how come that some manuscript from Alexandria and the Western family battling the received test? If Johnny's in the chat, I don't know if you want to re-explain your question for us. I'll say it again. It says, so I will ask, how come that some manuscripts from Alexandria and the Western family battling received the test?
So how come what?
How come that some... What I will ask, if Johnny is in the chat, I will ask if he can just retype the question, just so I
And
can.
also, Clarissa, I think you mentioned his first statement was that he does believe what?
He said from the analysis, so I'm assuming from what you've said so far, Christianity is more closer to truth.
Okay. While he's typing it out, may I also again remind us that an inquirer, when you ask, you do not ask only on one side. You always, like I said, make two theories. So even in this instance, if you are asking about the Bible, then you should also ask about the Quran. And you should also ask about the Buddhist literature. And you should also ask about any other one that you are studying. In other words, don't ask only about the manuscripts of Alexandria. You have nothing to compare it with if you just ask about that. You should look for some other manuscript from another place if you have a question and put those two together and then figure out which is more reliable, which is more authentic, which is more credible. To ask just one, I wonder if you remember the first evening we started when I said that avoids conclusions by default. Because you might find something wrong there and you might want to discard it, but don't discard it because the other is worse. So that is why you look for both. So if you find, and I said you can't ever make a good decision when it comes to religious ideas. You can only make a bad decision or a worse decision or the worst decision. What's the meaning of bad? There'll be questions like this, gaps, discrepancies. So when you look at a gap and discrepancy, that's fine. You should ask that question, but always ask it on every other literature to be fair. So is there the question clarified now?
Oh, he says, I hear you. I'm hoping he'll be able to retype the question, and then if anything, we'll do that in the next break. I do have one hand up as well from Kwame. So if Kwame wants to ask his question.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes. A lot of feedback.
Feedback. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. And when you go to the Hadith,
yes,
it makes mention of the Tawheed, giving the idea that the Muslims believe in a monotheistic God. You understand? But at the same time, it gives a background of sort of a pluralism, isn't it? Okay. Now,
I didn't get what you're saying. Just one moment. I said yesterday I am a little hard of hearing.
Okay, so that's faster. Okay, I'm a stammerer. I'm sorry.
Speak
I'm going to take my time and then speak slowly.
Yes.
When you go to the Hadith,
yes,
it gives. It makes mention of the Tawheed.
Tawheed.
That's right. In the Hadith, yeah.
Yes.
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 I mean the impression that the Muslims believe in one God, but at the same time, like we Christians, in the triune God. You understand it? Is there any correlation between that, between the two?
I'm not sure what your question is, but I can try to answer that.
Let me explain it further. Do you understand it? Okay. You know what? The Hadith.
Yes, I know the Tawheed.
Good.
Tawheed is the oneness of God.
The oneness of God.
Of all the religions on earth, the Muslims are the most fiercely monotheistic. Tawheed is their top understanding. If you break that, then you have committed the sin of shirk. Shirk is the most unpardonable sin. So I agree. Tawheed is the top one, and they do not agree that anybody else can be attached to Allah. Only one. And now you are asking about the Christians having three. Is that your question?
The triune, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Triune.
We believe in it. We believe in the Trinity, but I say that we believe God is one.
Yes.
But when you explore the Tawheed,
yes,
it sometimes gives the impression that there's Muslims believes in, a sort of a triune God. I don't know if I'm correct. You understand it?
No, no, they don't believe in a triune God. In fact, like I said, they're the most fiercely monotheistic.
Mm-hmm.
However, there is something in the language of the Quran that allows us to even raise a little question, and that is there's an explanation, but that is this. If you look at, for example, the second chapter, Baqarah, Al Baqarah, in that whole chapter, hundreds of verses in one chapter, you will find many times, almost all the time, Allah refers to Himself with the plural pronoun we, our, us. But the Muslims will say that means that is just a question of language. It's not the question of saying God is more than one. So that is
That's my problem.
true.
Is yeah.
Yes. So when they say they are agreeing and or their claim is that God is one, I would not dispute that because I have no way to dispute that
Mm-hmm.
except I have read in the Quran and it does say we, our, and us. So when I ask them that, they say no, that's language. Okay, fair enough, language. So they do not agree to any way that God is more than one. Allah is unity,
Mm-hmm.
unity, one. That's it. So when
All
the
right.
Christians have three, they point to the Christians as saying, you are not monotheists, you are polytheists. And that is why there's an irreconcilable difference between the Islamic faith and the Christian faith. This is one of them, all right?
All
That
right.
they believe in one and we believe in three. However, like we would, out me, I would accept any Muslim who says us and we and our is only language. It does mean one. So then we should ask the Muslim also to accept the other side. And when they say three is actually one in spirit and in idea and in nature, the word that the Muslims themselves use, the Muslim scholars themselves use is Jawhar. If you're one in Jawhar, you can be counted as one. So in their writing itself, it is there. Three can be one. However, this is a very interesting concept. And when I was in Australia, there was a Muslim in the audience. I almost always speak to mixed audiences. And that's why I use this language that I'm using right now for this seminar, because you speak to all kinds of people. And there was a Muslim in this audience who stood up and he said, look, if you can reconcile three as being one and one as being three, then I'm ready to understand, ready to study Christianity. So the next 10 minutes I took and I described and I said, well, if you understand the three as one in here, then will you not agree that we can accept three and in one and one in three over here? And he looked at me and he said, I've never heard that before. I'm going to study Christianity from now on. So there was an explanation. There is an explanation. It takes a little time. If we have a little time after this, I don't mind discussing that with you to show how three can be one and one can be three. We accept
Okay.
it all the time. All right?
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you very much. We do have a couple more questions. Do you want me to
Sure.
hold these until later, or do you want to do these now?
Why don't we finish the topic? It's not very much longer, and then we'll do all that. Is that okay? All right,
thank
let's
you.
get on with this. Let me take a few seconds break. All right, here we are. Can you see the screen? Yes. Three factors may be considered when assessing the credibility of a historical piece of literature. And we saw that the one that has the closest so far is the New Testament. It has very short, in fact, in the historian's eyes, no gap at all. 10 years is not a gap. When it's generations, then it's called a gap. And all the time, Jesus was God. It was not that he became man to God in those writings little by little, right from the beginning. And so we're going to look now at these three factors: the gaps, number two, the number of manuscripts. Why do we look at the number of manuscripts backing the writing? Because let's say there are only three manuscripts. One is in your home, and one is in your school library, and one is in your office. And one night, some guys, they don't like the third chapter, second paragraph. They don't like it. So one night they go to all three and they change it. Now you have to change in all three so that in the morning nobody knows that there's changed, because all of them have been changed. So when you compare one with another, they'll think that it is the original one. So you have to change all three very quickly so that nobody notices the change. Now, it is possible to do that if we are 3, 4, and 5 in the same town. If we have 50 manuscripts, one there in Manchester and one in Birmingham and one in London and one in Edinburgh and one in some town in Wales, then tell me, how can you do change in all of them in one evening or 2 or 3 days? No, it'll be difficult. In fact, you might get caught. So when you see that it's a small number of manuscripts, you can always say it could have been changed. But when you see a large number of manuscripts saying the same thing, then you will have to agree it could not have been changed. It's hard to go through so many. And that's why we look at the number of manuscripts that are backing that particular writing. Okay, so that's number two. Number three, where were the authors in relationship to the story? Were they very close in terms of geography or in terms of time? In other words, was it in the next town, in your own town, that the event took place and you wrote it down? Or in time, was it in your own generation or in the next generation or 2, 3 generations later? That's the gap there. So the proximity of the authors is also one factor. If they were really close, then the credibility goes up. So now we saw, at least I did, that the New Testament seems to be quite strongly historical. So I compared that with 3 other writings that everybody considers as historical. For example, say Caesar's Gallic Wars. Everyone acknowledges that, and Herodotus' history and Tacitus' annals to be historical. You want to study Roman history? These 3. It's about the same time, if you notice, as it includes the time of the first century AD. You can get your MAs and PhDs by quoting these authors because they are historical. But now just watch the gaps. Caesar's Gallic War was written in 100 BC, and the earliest manuscript we have is 900 AD, a gap of 1,000 years. What's that gap mean? It means that for 1,000 years, nobody can vouch that anything was added or deleted or modified. 1,000 years. And still they call it historical. Herodotus' history, 1,300 years. And still you call it historical. Tacitus' annals, 1,000 years. Compare that with the New Testament, just 10 years actually, we saw with Eliezer Sukenik's writing, or what he found as writings. 10 years is no gap. What a difference between 1,000 years and even 20 or 50 years. We have to acknowledge that at this point of gaps, the New Testament really, rises right on top. So what about the number of manuscripts? Caesar's Gallic Wars is backed by 10 manuscripts worldwide. 10. Herodotus' history by 8. Tacitus' annals by 20 manuscripts. The top of Greek literature is Homer's Iliad. Homer's Iliad is backed by 643 manuscripts. Did any of you say wow? Remember what I said? When something is impressive, you have got to say wow. Yeah, compared to 10 and 20 and 8, 643 is really high up there. Now, what if I told you that the New Testament writing is backed by 686 manuscripts? Then what? Whoa, we have to say wow, right? So, what is the number? The New Testament is backed by 5,686 Greek manuscripts. If you add the Armenian and the Arabic and the Latin and all the other languages that we have of these manuscripts, do you know how many manuscripts back the New Testament? 24,900 manuscripts back the New Testament. Tell me, do we have a base which you can look to, which we can rely on and say it could not have changed in its core story? It could not, because there are just too many manuscripts. So that was number two. Number three is the proximity of the authors. Where were these authors? And here are three statements. Peter is writing, we did not follow fables, but were eyewitnesses. And John, he writes, from that hour, that disciple, and that's referring to himself, that disciple took her, Mary, to his own home. So what is John saying? He's talking about himself. And Acts is written by Luke. When we had sailed, we came to Myra. We, inside the story, we were eyewitnesses. We did this. We sailed over the sea. Where were these authors? Were they close to the story or far from the story? We'll have to agree they were close. Friends, they were not just close, they were inside the story. They were part of the story. And if you look at inside and outside, you can't get any closer than inside. If you try to get any closer than inside, you'll go outside. That's the way it is. If you are in this room and you want to get into this room and you don't know you're in this room, then you look for the door and go out. So you can't get any closer than inside. That's all I'm saying. This is the closest. So it's amazing that the New Testament is so strongly set as historical. Look, others have also seen it, and here are some statements. No other ancient book has anything like such early and plentiful testimony to its text, and no unbiased scholar would deny that the text that has come down to us is substantially sound. In the variety and fullness of the evidence on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone among ancient prose writings. Not ancient religious prose writings, ancient prose writings across the board. You can start from the earliest unstructured writings like the Mayans and the Sumerians, and then throw in the Babylonians and the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Chinese and the Indian, the Roman and the Greek, and put them all together on this table, and one little bitty book will rise up above all of them as the best attested historical piece of literature in the world, and it is called the New Testament. To be skeptical then of the resultant text of the New Testament books is to allow all of classical antiquity to slip into obscurity, for no document of the ancient period are as well attested bibliographically as the New Testament. So if you want to discard the New Testament and say, oh, I've got a question about it, then you have to discard pharaohs, Chinese dynasties, Babylon, Cyrus the Great, Alexander the Great, Caesar Augustus, Julius Caesar, everyone out. Because this book is a better attested historical piece of literature than any of the others that mentions all of these. Amazing. Yes, it is. Don't try to throw it off just because you find some things that are questionable. Hold on to it, because everything else is inferior. Which is the gold standard? We often say, oh, I don't know what's in the Bible and in the New Testament. Let's look at the secular history to endorse it. No, it is exactly the opposite. This is the gold standard because this has the features of the most historical piece of literature. It has the least gaps, in fact, no gaps. It has the greatest amount of manuscript evidence, and the authors were right inside the story. You cannot find another historical piece of literature that has this strong base as the New Testament. So while the Quran and the New Testament are historical in nature according to the criteria that we applied, the New Testament clearly stands as the highest, which has the highest credibility and integrity of texts. So, yeah, there are questions? Of course there are. But hold on to it, because if you say there are questions and this, therefore I'm putting it here, setting it aside, then the question is, which one will you have to put in its place? Because whatever you have to put in its place is worse. So, yeah, you made a bad decision by following the New Testament, but anything else is worse. So, hold on to the bad, because in this context, the bad is the best. So, question time.
Fantastic. I had to retype that for myself so I can remember that the New Testament is the gold standard. It has the highest credibility and integrity of text. That's definitely something I will remember. So we do have quite a few more questions.
Yeah.
So the first one, so it says forgive me of my pronunciation, the the
Bhagavad Gita, yeah.
Says that God was born on earth, died here, and is now exalted and lives forever. That sounds much like Christianity's writings of Jesus. The difference being that the continuum is recorded all in one place, the Bible. According to this, it would sound like Christ is a legend. What do you think about this statement?
What you are doing is making an artificial connection, because first of all, you are saying that because it's written in the Bhagavad Gita, it's talking about Jesus. It is not talking about Jesus at all. It's talking about Krishna, if anything. In fact, Krishna is not discussed as a person who went to heaven. He was only an incarnate here, and incarnations die in the Hindu faith. They have, and he was the eighth, by the way. So there was first one, Matsya the fish, and then Kurma the turtle, and on and on and on came to the eighth. The seventh was Rama, the big name, and then Krishna, eighth, and the ninth, in some circles, is also called Gautama Buddha or even Balarama, just mentioning what they're saying, and the 10th is yet to come. Now, when you look at Balarama, he died, so nobody's gone to heaven. So I'm not sure where you got the idea that in the Bhagavad Gita it says that. I have read it and I do not see it there that Krishna was born here, went to heaven. What it does say is that there is a way to go to heaven, to enter that paradise, Brahmaloka, the place where the planetary systems where Brahma dwells. Yes, you can get there, but that has nothing to do with Jesus at all. So we should not artificially put them together. So your question of putting them together itself breaks down right there. So what was the last part of your question? So what does it say? You're muted.
She's just responded to your comment. So my question states that Jesus and Krishna have similar origins.
In one sense, as a story, yes, as a story, but they are not the same. So as a story you can have, but remember what we just said. If one is mythological and one is historical, then whatever else is attached to the historical we accept, but what is attached to the mythological, we put a big question mark. We don't dismiss it, we just put a big question mark, but you cannot put that big question mark on the story of Jesus, because the New Testament is solidly historical, whereas the Bhagavad Gita, which is written in the Mahabharata, that is mythological. Everybody agrees to that. I have not met a single Hindu scholar who does not agree that that's mythological. So one is at the highest level of credibility, which is historical, and among the historical, the best historical, and one is a mythological. We should not put them together unless you want to just force them If you want to force them, then you can force together anything on earth. So don't put them together. If the stories are the same, yep. In fact, there are many stories about, the virgin birth also in other places. That doesn't mean that they are the Christian gospel or the Christian gospel is them. There are many similarities. In trying to understand these two, here's how we look at it. I will suggest that I'm a medical oriented guy, so I will look at, say, biology. In biology, there's something known as classification, and there's also something known as identification. When you classify, you look at all the similarities and classify them. But when you want to identify them, you must look at the dissimilarities. So let's classify them. They're all together in this kind of story because there are similarities. So let me give you an example of this in birds. If they have feathers and beaks and tubular bones and lay eggs in nests, then we call them birds. So when you look at all these features, if they have these three or four features, birds. But that doesn't mean a vulture is the same as a hummingbird. No, they're entirely different. So why is a bird called the vulture so different from a hummingbird, which is also a bird? Because there are irreconcilable differences. Once there is a difference, you cannot call them the same. You can classify them, but you cannot identify them as the same. So have I described it clearly enough? You can classify the stories of Krishna and Jesus kind of together. Both had this kind of birth and both maybe went to heaven, but you cannot identify them as the same. Whereas in some places, you can identify people as the same one. The one who murdered ran off there. Then you go and take a picture there, take a picture here and put them. Hey, they're the same. That's the way you say that they are the same. Just because they have similarities, they are not the same. Especially if they have even 1 point of irreconcilable difference. And there is a whole bunch of points that are irreconcilably different here.
Fantastic. So the next question I have is the Bible then credible because of the timeline in which it was written? Because it was written soon after his lifetime. I'm assuming his is referring to Jesus.
Yes. That's what we were saying are the three factors we took into consideration.
Yeah.
That the timeline should be very small. We should have a large number of manuscripts, and the authors should be also very close by. Then the credibility of that text is better than another text that does not have these characteristics in such great measure. Now, that doesn't mean that it is the best. It's the best according to our assessment today because that's all we have. So we should go by the best today. Suppose tomorrow we find something better, then you have to go to that. But can you imagine another piece of literature that is better than this? I can't. So right now, as of today, because of these three clearly established factors, I must say that the text of the New Testament is the most reliable text of any literature of the ancient period. I'm not saying it is God's word, not yet. I'm just saying it is the most reliable text. In other words, the writing itself, the words in the writing are the correct writing that the author wrote, not somebody else who put something else in.
Fantastic. So another question has come in. It says, how do you deal with questions and objections to faith that your friends may pose?
That is a broad question. And
Yeah.
here's how I would suggest, with the information I've given you right now, we could discuss the specific question. But since the question is broad, I'll give you a broad answer. And the broad answer is this. Whenever somebody says something different from what you believe, do not attack it. Just accept it. Place it on one side of the table and honestly try to understand it first. Then make the opposite theory. Like I said, always have two theories. Place it here, their theory, Give it the best chance, give it all the opportunity to get the most number of points in your mind, and then make the opposite theory on this side and do the same thing here now, and give it the best chance to have the most points on its side, and then weigh them both. You will find that when you weigh them both, one side will win. God has, if there is a God of truth, God has never placed within us things are so confusing that there can never be a weight of evidence that is discernible. You can discern a weight of evidence. Now, here there are some rules that we must follow. Number one is, when you want to weigh it out, you must first decide what is your source of information. Is it a book? Is it a certain body of people? Is it a certain committee? Is it a certain individual, a God man or a prophet or something? You decide that beforehand, and then here's how you say it. According to either that book or according to that committee, when we decided about these two, the weight of evidence is on this side, and therefore this is more credible. That's how you do it. You don't simply just say this is good or this is bad. So when anybody says something that is different, listen, accept it. For all you know, they may be saying something that you didn't understand before, and it might help you to understand your own views. So never discard anything right away. Always have a neutral inquiry attitude, not believing, not disbelieving. So I've given you a broad outline of what you do when somebody disagrees with you. In fact, this whole seminar basically is built on that. How do you decide when there's a controversy, when there are two sides?
I think we'll definitely have to have you back to go into that more, because I would definitely be interested in that for sure, as well as other people as well listening. So we have a question here. I think this is based on what was asked earlier, and I think they've just changed their question a little bit. So they've restructured their question. So it says, it seems there has been some manipulations in the literature of Islam. How is this different from the same manipulations in the Bible from the manuscript of Alexandria, the ancestor of the Western family, against the received text? Can we say God inspired these changes?
I think there are at least three questions you've put into one. You have assumed a whole lot. So let's go into it one by one. What's the first part?
Okay, so they say it seems
Yes.
there have been some manipulations in the literature of Islam.
Yes. You can't really, you shouldn't use the word manipulation, because that immediately throws it off. So like I said, when you see something different, don't throw it off, just say change, because the moment you say manipulation, it talks about trickery and things like that. Even if it is trickery, don't start by saying manipulation, just say there are changes. So we agree there are changes. Like I said, every early ancient writing has changes, so we agree on that. What's the next one?
And then, so how is this different from the same manipulations, stroke changes, in the Bible from the manuscript of Alexandria?
I'm not sure what you mean by the manuscripts of Alexandria, number one. So think about it and let us know. While I ask you this question, you are saying it, you use the word same changes. Then you have to first tell us how you assumed it's the same changes. So the changes here are the same type of changes here. How did you come to that conclusion? Because I think that's an assumption. And honestly, I'm willing to listen to you. But honestly, right now, I cannot see them being the same. So that assumption itself is in question now. When you say it's the same, I will say, wait a minute, I would like to question whether it's the same. And then, like I said, what is this manuscripts from Alexandria? I'm not sure about what that is.
Yeah, and
Because,
then they
because
end with a final question saying, can we say God inspired these changes?
You mean to say
Again,
that we are talking about the changes, right?
yeah, the changes in the
Okay.
Bible.
All right. What we can know, and this is actually quite a big question, and it's a good question because you are assuming that any change is inspired by God just because he inspired the writing. So we have to study that out. Did he inspire the writing? And because of he inspired the writing, he also inspired the change. Well, that is one theory. Like I said, okay, let's put one theory on this side. God inspired the change. And the other side of the theory would be God did not inspire the change. So now we have two theories. We are not discussing whether God inspired the writing. We are discussing whether God inspired the change or the manipulation. So when you look at the change, how can we decide whether God inspired the change? What would be the criteria to say God inspired the change so that we can know when the criteria are not there, we can say God did not inspire the change. And you'll find you'll run into a lot of problems with that question. And so I'm suggesting that the question needs to be questioned. You know, when I was doing my search over the years and why it took so long was because I had to many times ask whether my question is valid. Because if you have a question that is itself questionable, then even if you answer it correctly, you are going in the wrong direction. So you must be able to question your question and find out whether it's a credible question itself. Most of us like to ask the question and we look for the correct answers. I'm suggesting that in this big tussle with really coming to know the truth of the matter between us and God, sometimes we must take a step back and ask ourselves whether it is the correct question we are asking, not whether it's the correct answer we want. Is it the correct question to say God has inspired the changes? So I will say, hey, that's a good question. Let's put it there and let's study it out. Right now, I feel it doesn't seem to stand, but I will be open to see whether God inspired the change. And if he inspired the change, then we should also have some reason for that change. God doesn't do anything without a reason. He, in his own mind, he must have a reason. And if it's not communicated to us, we can say, okay, it's in his mind, we don't know. But he must have a reason. So we must try to look for that. And if it is no reason at all, just simply changed, then we have to figure out on what basis we are saying that God inspired the change. I would, right as of now, I would stay with the fact that God inspired the writing. The question of change is a question. So when you look at a question like that, you take some time to figure out, first of all, how will you make out it's a question, it's a change that God inspired? Here's the reason I'm saying that. Whenever God speaks in his way to humans, he tells a person what to do. For example, he never forces the person to do it. Did you know that? The God of the New Testament never forces anyone to do anything. There are some places where he puts a block, I agree. But when it comes to recognition of a truth of the matter, he never forces anyone. So if it has to be a question of whether something is going to trip somebody up, I would say that is against the whole idea of God telling us the truth. So he's giving a person who is writing the inspiration to write it. Later on, if somebody wants to change that, he may or may not allow that. And what do we mean by change? We mean change the core part of the story, not the peripheral parts. We are not talking about the peripheral part. That's why I would like to figure out from the questioner which part of the change are we talking about. Because if it is peripheral, it doesn't make any difference. Whereas if it is central, is it central? For example, is Jesus really a human being who came as an incarnate of God to save the human race? Then, if that is questioned by the change in the writing, then I would say that's something worth looking into. We will look into it. But if it is the question of whether he was born in 4 BC or 3.5 BC, then I would say that's really no difference. That makes no difference. So I would look at to see what the changes are. And I would really challenge the question of same change. There is no same change in the Quran as to the manuscripts of Alexandria. But I still want to know what this manuscripts of Alexandria refers to.
Thank you very much for that. I think we just have a few more minutes, so we're going to try and squeeze in a couple more in there. So another question for you is, did Muhammad really have a vision?
I think you're assuming the vision to be only from one source, and from that is from God. Well, you can have a vision from the supernatural, which needn't be from God. So in that sense, yes, he had a vision, but the question is, from where did the vision come? So I would say, yes, of course he had a vision. He claimed. I don't know whether he had a vision. Okay, that's number one. I'm just taking his claim because that's all we can do. When a person claims, we say, okay, fine, he said angel Jibril came and spoke to him. Fine, that's what you saw. I'll accept it, but I'll have my own questions relating to what is after that. What did he say? What did he not say? But if you say you had a vision, I will accept it.
Thank you. And finally, does the Sikh religion have their own literature, and who do they believe in?
Very interesting. I'm presuming this is the same person who asked a question on the Sikhism earlier, whether there's any contradiction in the Sikh literature. That's good. I really like that because then it becomes a real question. See, if you don't know what the others are saying, you can't even bring a question. And that's why I like it when you please go out and talk to others and have a lot of questions, because there are lots of questions. So thank you for that question. So the question here is Sikh religion, once again, the question?
Does the Sikh religion have their own literature?
Literature, yes.
Who do they believe?
Okay, here's how the Sikh religion came about. The first the first guru was Guru Nanak. And when he came out, he was lost for a few days in the community and people didn't know where he was. And then he came out. Now, at that time in India, in the Indian peninsula, the Hindus and the Muslims were fighting to the death. They were just mad at each other. So he came out after 3 days of being lost to his community. Nobody knew where he was. He came out and said, the first sentence he said, there is no Hindu, there is no Muslim. So that is how the Sikh religion began. So who is God? Well, they defined God with these 3 words. He is the formless, limitless, nameless one. So no name, limitless, formless, nameless. Why? Don't give him a name like Allah and don't give him a name like Krishna and Rama and all that. Just follow this. So then later, there are 10 gurus who came one after the other. And they started writing stuff and they put it together into their literature. But the main way in which the people recognized what the truth was if the guru said so. All right? So if the guru said so, that is it. So any question, ask the guru. When he died, his son became the guru and then went to the 9th guru. When the 9th guru died, Guru Gobind Singh, he didn't have a son. So now what shall we do? He doesn't have a son. So how shall we know the truth? So they took all the writings and they called it Grantha Sahib. That is the writings. And what they did was accept the Granth Sahib, which is the writings, as the next guru. Not a human. Now it would be the writing. And so the Granth Sahib is now called the Guru Granth Sahib. And the Guru Granth Sahib is kept today in the Golden Temple in Amritsar in India. And that is the place where they get all their ideas about whatever they believe in. And that is their literature. So what is their God? No named, nameless, formless, limitless one. And that is why their religion doesn't talk much about God. The religion talks about being equal one with the other. Therefore, if you go to that to the temple there, you are served, whether you are of their faith or not. And how are you served? You are served sitting in the same plane as anybody else. If they are sitting on the ground, then you have to sit on the ground because that's it. No one high, no one low. Everybody is given the same food, showing that everybody is really the same before God. So, in that sense, yeah, it's a good idea. But really, it still stems from Hinduism. And the way you really get to that God is still through karma. You have to still do your things and do it correctly. There is no such thing as a savior in that religion. So that is basically what they believe in their God and how you reach there. It's very in very simple terms.
Thank you very much for breaking that down for us, Dr. Pandit. And as well for this evening, you've definitely helped us to journey in finding the red marble. And I definitely look forward to tomorrow, where we will continue to do that. Tomorrow, we will continue in the comparison of religious literature, looking at part 2 and part 3. And I really hope you all will join us again tomorrow at 7 p.m. If you do have any questions that hasn't been asked yet or anything that's come to mind, we have put a link in the chat. So use the link, send us a question, and we'll have that ready for tomorrow. Or even better, make sure you're with us tomorrow at 7 p.m. where we can ask the questions directly to Dr. Pandit tomorrow evening as well. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you again, Dr. Pandit. And we look forward to hearing you again tomorrow. Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening. Goodbye.
Good evening. Bye.